The first thing I noticed was the silence from the house next door. It wasn't an immediate alarm, more of a slow, dawning observation that settled over the course of a week, like dust. I've lived in this grey shingled cottage at the end of Laurel Lane for 3 years. Mrs. Ainsley, who lived in the slightly larger, white-clabbered house next to mine, was a creature of quiet, predictable habit. Every Tuesday and Friday morning, precisely at 9, I would hear the muffled, melodic chime of her doorbell. It was the old-fashioned kind, 2 distinct tones. A few minutes later, a young man in a dark blue jacket would leave her porch, carrying a small, green, insulated bag. Groceries, I assumed. Prescriptions, perhaps. I never asked. We had the kind of neighbourly relationship that suited us both. A wave from our respective gardens, a brief comment on the weather if we happened to be checking our mailboxes at the same time. She tended her rose bushes with a gloved, meticulous care. I preferred the wilder, easier ferns and hostas that crowded my shaded plot. Her Tuesday and Friday ritual was as much a part of the landscape as the old oak that stood between our properties, its branches fingering out over both our roofs. Last Tuesday, the chime didn't sound. I was at my desk by the window, working on translating a series of technical documents for a German engineering firm, a job that requires a deep, uninterrupted focus on precise meanings. The silence at 9 o'clock was a subtle jolt, a missed beat in a familiar rhythm. I looked up, waited. Nothing. I reasoned she was out or unwell, or perhaps the delivery service had changed its schedule. It was a small thing, easily explained. But on Friday, the silence repeated itself. A perfect, unbroken quiet at 9 a.m. That was the beginning, the first tiny crack in the ordinary surface of things. I saw her only once that week, on Wednesday afternoon. She was standing at her kitchen window, a pale figure behind the glass, holding a teacup. She didn't wave. She seemed to be looking not at her garden, but at the base of the old oak tree, her expression one of simple, tired contemplation. I raised a hand, but she didn't appear to see me. I went back to my work, but the words on my screen seemed less substantial than they had before, as if the silence from next door had somehow thinned the reality of my own. The weekend passed with a heavy, quiet rain. On Monday morning, I decided to perform a small, casual test. At 5 minutes to 9, I made a cup of tea and stood at my own kitchen window, which offered an angled view of her front porch and door. The rain had softened to a drizzle, muting the colours of the world to a palette of greens and greys. 9 o'clock arrived. The damp air carried no sound but the drip of water from the eaves. No car came up the lane. No young man in blue approached. And most tellingly, no two-tone chime parted the stillness. It was then that I saw the curtain in her upstairs window, the one that had always been open during the day, was drawn completely shut. It was a deep burgundy red, and it looked utterly foreign against the white frame. I had never seen it closed before. I finished my tea, the china clinking too loudly in the quiet kitchen. The rest of my day was normal, or I tried to make it so. I went for a walk. I answered emails. I made a simple dinner. But my attention kept drifting back to that closed burgundy curtain, a small wrong stitch in the familiar tapestry of my view. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd actually seen Mrs. Ainsley in her garden. Had it been 2 weeks? 3? The thought was cold and smooth in my mind, like a stone pulled from a riverbed. I told myself I was being foolish, that I was manufacturing mystery out of the private life of an elderly woman who owed me no explanation. But the logic didn't stick. It was the precision of the silence that bothered me. It wasn't just an absence of noise. It was the absence of a specific, recurring sound that had, without my conscious acknowledgement, become a foundation of my own weekly rhythm. Its disappearance didn't create a void. It created a different kind of shape, one I couldn't yet see. The patterns, once I started looking for them, were everywhere. They were small. the kind of details you would normally dismiss as coincidence or forget entirely. But I was attuned now. My focus shifted from the broad strokes of my days to the faint pencil lines beneath. The blue-jacketed delivery man never returned. That specific silence at 9 on Tuesdays and Fridays became a permanent feature. But other sounds changed too. Mrs. Ainsley had always listened to the radio in the afternoons. I could never make out the program, just the faint, papery murmur of a voice through her open kitchen window. That sound was also gone. In its place, 3 times a day, at dawn, at noon, and just after sunset, I began to hear a single, low note. It was not a musical note, not from an instrument I could name. It was more organic, like the sound a large, hollow piece of wood might make if you struck it gently, or a deep, muted gong submerged in water. It was so low it was almost a feeling in the chest as much as a sound in the ear. It seemed to come from the direction of her house, but it was impossible to pinpoint. The first time I heard it at dawn, I was half asleep and thought it was a dream. At noon, I was pruning the ferns and heard it clearly, a vibration that hung in the humid air for a moment before being absorbed by the trees. I stood very still, my shears in hand, and waited. Nothing followed it. It was just a marker, a tonal bookmark placed in the flow of time. Then there were the lights. Her house had always been dark by 10 p.m. Now, a single warm yellow light burned in what I guessed was her sitting room until exactly midnight. At the stroke of 12, I watched it from my bedroom window. It did not fade or switch off. It vanished, as if a shutter had fallen behind the glass. Instant, complete darkness. One evening, driven by a curiosity that had become a quiet itch, I walked a slow circuit around the perimeter of our shared property line. The grass was wet with dew. From the back, I could see the glow of that single lamp through the drawn curtains of the sitting room. And in the small, enclosed back porch, I saw something new. A row of what looked like smooth, dark stones, each about the size of a loaf of bread, arranged in a neat line on the floor. They were black, but with a faint, oily sheen where the light from the house touched them. They did not look like garden stones. They looked placed, intentional. As I stood there in the gathering dark, I felt a sudden, intense sensation of being examined. Not watched from the window, but examined, as a specimen under a gentle, indifferent lens. It was so strong, I took a step back, my foot crunching on a twig. The feeling dissipated immediately, leaving only the normal chill of the night air. I went back inside, my heart beating a little too quickly. The next morning, I saw the second pattern involving the oak tree. A perfect circle of fallen leaves, all a crisp, uniform brown, lay directly under its widest boughs. The leaves within the circle were dry and arranged almost concentrically. Outside the circle, the ground was bare. It looked as though the tree had decided to shed only in that one defined space. I walked over and stood in the center of the circle. The air felt stiller, denser. I looked up through the branches to Mrs. Ainsley's window. The burgundy curtain was still drawn. For the first time, I considered knocking on her door. The thought filled me with a profound and unexpected reluctance, a physical resistance that felt like pushing against a soft, invisible barrier. So I didn't. I went back to my work, to my translations of torque specifications and metallurgical grades. The solid, factual language was a comfort, but it also felt increasingly like a code I was using to describe a world whose underlying principles were slowly, quietly changing. The questioning began in earnest, not with fear, but with a deep, methodological curiosity. I am a translator. My entire profession is built on the belief that there is a true meaning to be found, an equivalent concept in another system of symbols. What was happening next door felt like a text in a language I didn't know, but one that was operating on the same page as my own. I started a notebook. Not a diary of feelings, but a log. I recorded the times of the low wooden notes. They were never off by more than a minute. I sketched the pattern of the stones on the back porch as best I remembered it. I noted the continued absence of the delivery chime, the persistent closed curtain, the precise extinction of the light at midnight. I began to experiment, subtly. One Tuesday at 9, I deliberately stepped out onto my porch and began to hammer a loose board, creating a sharp, percussive noise in the time slot where the chime should have been. The sound felt wrong, aggressively out of place, as if I was shouting in a library. After 3 blows, a profound wave of nausea passed over me, not sickening but blanketing, forcing me to stop and sit on the steps until it passed. The silence that rushed back in afterward was deeper than before. My action had not broken the pattern. It had only made me acutely aware of my own discordance with it. I found my thoughts turning inward, questioning not just the events next door, but the nature of my own perception. Was I witnessing something, or was I somehow participating in it? The feeling of being examined returned at odd moments, while washing dishes or in the middle of a sentence in an email. It was a neutral feeling, devoid of malice, but it had the effect of making me feel transparent, as if my own internal monologue were not entirely my own. I began to dream of the oak tree. In the dreams, its roots were not buried in earth, but in a network of soft, pulsating light that stretched under both our houses. The dark stones from the porch were arranged in a circle among the roots, humming. Mrs. Ainsley was there too, not as an old woman, but as a younger version of herself, or perhaps simply a version without age. She was tending to the roots, not the roses. The dreams were not nightmares, they were serene, heavy with a significance I couldn't grasp upon waking. They left me with a residue of solemn understanding that evaporated by the time I had my coffee. Reality itself started to feel porous. One afternoon I was certain I saw a flicker of movement in the gap between her drawn curtain and the window frame. Not a person moving, but a shift in the quality of the light behind the fabric, a slow, liquid swirl of gold and shadow like oil on water. When I blinked, it was gone. I tried to research, but my searches were futile. What terms could I use? Low, recurring wooden note, circle of fallen leaves, stones on porch, feeling of being observed. It sounded like the ramblings of a paranoid mind, and perhaps it was. That was the core of the questioning. Had I stumbled upon a genuine mystery, or was I, alone in this house with my precise and lonely work, slowly unraveling? The evidence argued against madness. The patterns were external, measurable. The nausea when I disrupted the silence was physical. The stones were objectively there. But the meaning was utterly elusive. It felt spiritual, but not in a religious sense. It felt like living beside a process, a slow, deliberate ritual whose purpose was so fundamental it needed no explanation, only adherence. I was no longer afraid for Mrs. Ainsley. I was afraid, and deeply curious, about what she was now a part of. The realization formed over the course of a single, utterly still day. It was a Sunday. No deliveries, no work emails, just the slow bleed of hours. I had given up my log. The data was complete and pointed nowhere. Instead, I simply sat in my armchair, watching the light move across the floor of my sitting room, listening to the quiet of the house and the quieter house next door. The low note sounded at noon, its resonance lingering, and as it faded, I had a simple, clear thought. It is a heartbeat. Not a biological one, but the heartbeat of a system. The 3 daily notes were not signals, they were pulses. They were checking the rhythm. The patterns I observed, the timed light, the stone markers, the perfect circle of leaves, were not the mystery itself. They were the symptoms of a state of being. Mrs. Ainsley's house was not the site of an event. It was in a state of profound, concentrated attention. The disappearance of the mundane routines, the groceries, the radio, wasn't because they had stopped. It was because they had become irrelevant. She had moved, or was being moved, to a different set of necessities. I thought of the feeling of being examined. It wasn't surveillance, it was assessment, a gentle periodic scanning from the source of that state next door, like a lighthouse beam passing over me. I was adjacent to the focus, close enough to feel its edges. The resistance I felt when I thought of knocking. It wasn't my fear. It was a soft, protective field, a gentle suggestion to stay back, for my own good. The system was maintaining its integrity. My experiments with noise had triggered a mild corrective response, the nausea, a way of discouraging interference. The dream of the roots made a terrible, beautiful sense. The process was not happening in the house. It was happening below it, using the house and Mrs. Ainsley as its anchor, conduit. The oak tree standing between us, its roots deep in the earth, was a part of the apparatus. The circle of leaves was a fall of spent energy, neatly contained. This was not an invasion. There was no malevolence. It was a natural process, but one from a layer of nature I had never perceived, like magnetism or gravity, usually invisible, now for some reason becoming faintly visible here, in this quiet place, through this quiet woman. She hadn't been taken over, she had aligned herself. Perhaps she had always been aligned, and the deliveries and the radio were just her previous, gentle attempts to live in my world while attending to another. Now, for a time, that pretense was over. The realization was cold and clear. I was not living next to a person undergoing a crisis. I was living next to a focal point, a lens through which something vast and slow and quiet was focusing its attention on something. On itself? On the fabric of this place. The purpose remained hidden, but the nature of the phenomenon crystallized in my mind. It was a kind of calibrated stillness, a deliberate and ritualized withdrawal from one frequency of existence to resonate more purely with another. And I was in the near field, close enough to hear the hum. Yesterday, the burgundy curtain opened. It was late afternoon and the light was long and low, casting the world in amber. I saw it from my garden. The deep red fabric was simply gone, pulled back, and the window was clear. Through it, I could see the empty sitting room. The chair by the window was vacant. The room was spotless, austere. The single lamp was gone. The house had the hollow, waiting look of a shell. The stones on the back porch were also gone. The circle of leaves under the oak had been scattered by a wind I hadn't felt. All the patterns had ceased. The silence was no longer a pregnant, attentive thing. It was just the ordinary silence of an empty house. The low notes did not sound at sunset. The light did not come on at night. The process, whatever it was, had completed its cycle. This morning, a different car, a modest silver sedan, pulled into Mrs. Ainsley's drive. A man and a woman in ordinary clothes got out. They had a key. They let themselves in. They did not look like relatives. They looked like agents or custodians. They carried no boxes, no luggage. They were inside for about an hour. When they left, they locked the door behind them. As they drove away, I made a decision. I walked across the damp grass, past the now indistinct patch under the oak, and up onto her porch. The air felt completely normal. I raised my hand and for the first time pressed her doorbell. The familiar two-toned chime rang out inside the empty house, bright and clear and mundane. It was just a sound again. I waited. No one came. I turned to leave, and my eye caught something wedged in the corner of the doorframe, where the wood had slightly splintered. It was a single dried rose petal, a deep, velvety crimson. It was not from any of the roses in her garden. Those were pale pink and yellow. This was a color I had never seen there. I picked it up. It was perfectly dry, paper thin, and it carried not a scent, but a faint, static charge that tingled against my fingertips for a second before fading. I am back in my house now. The silver car has not returned. The world has snapped back to its normal axis. The mystery has not been solved. It has concluded. I understand now that I was not a detective, and this was not a puzzle to be solved. I was a witness to a season, a private, necessary season for the woman next door, one that required a specific, rigorous quiet. I hold the petal in my hand. It is the only physical evidence, and it proves nothing to anyone but me. The unsettling truth, the quiet meaning that changes everything, is this. The world is not only stranger than I supposed, but it is also far more polite. It goes about its vast, unknowable business with a minimal disruption, gently discouraging curiosity with a wave of nausea, drawing a curtain, allowing only those who live at the very edge of its focus to sense the barest outline of its passing. Mrs. Ainsley was not a victim. She was a gardener of a different sort. And I think perhaps she may have left this petal there for me, not as an explanation, but as a token, a thank you for not knocking, for respecting the silence. I place it on the windowsill where I can see it. The ordinary sounds of my life, the click of my keyboard, the sigh of the kettle, feel different now. They are not the whole of reality. They are just the surface sounds, and beneath them, I know, there is a deep, quiet pulse. And sometimes, in certain places, for certain people, the curtain draws closed and the work begins. I will likely never see her again, or if I do, she will be just an old woman tending her roses, and we will speak of the weather. And I will understand that this too is part of the courtesy.